Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to today's SurvivorCircle session, Cultural Delusions Concerning Men's Trauma. I'm Becky Perkins. I'm the Survivor Support Specialist with Zero Abuse Project, and we're excited that you've joined us today. A couple of notes about how to participate today before we get started. So this session, as always, is being live streamed on YouTube. If you would like to see your screen larger, you can click on the small square icon in the bottom right corner of the box on Survivor Space, and it will bring up a larger image of the presentation. To ask a question or to comment, you can type directly into the chat box on the SurvivorCircle's page. Our presenter is going to speak for about a half hour or so, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions or comments. So again, thank you for joining us today, and I am very pleased to welcome back Rick Goodwin from Men in Healing. Rick, welcome.
Hey, Becky. Thanks for the warm introduction, and glad to be here today. So welcome to welcome to our studio audience. And today, yes, we'll be talking about male sexual victimization and the notion of cultural delusion. So this is our focus today. And I think before I say anything else, I would just want to make recognition that we're providing this service through the good people at the Department of Justice. And as with all Survivor Space programming, this was a funding award to the Zero Abuse Project from the Office for Victims of Crime, and we're very appreciative of their belief and confidence of our work. Now, to get going, people may say, what the heck is this notion of cultural delusions? And I think I need to explain that first before we can get into the impact male survivors in particular have, given their past experiences of abuse. Now, I wish I had a good prop for you to do this, and all I have really is a white container here, but I can assure you that inside this white container is a clear, odorless beverage that I got from the tap. Now, well, if we were all in the same room and I passed this around, you may well taste that beverage and say that's water. But if I really believed that what was in my container was like a really fine beer, maybe a highly hopped IPA, with lots of subtle flavor notes. And if I really believed that, really believed that, people could say, oh, Rick's kind of delusional. He's not connected to reality. What he's saying is really not true, even though he believes that. Now, again, if we were all in the same room and I passed this container of liquid to everyone else, each one of you, and you all said, wow, that is a really fine beer, Rick. Where'd you get that? I'd like to get some at home. I think this is the best IPA I've ever had. If that happened, we'd no longer be talking about Rick's delusion, but we would be talking about a mass delusion. Because we're all carrying that, we're all holding that. So the term now of cultural delusions are fundamental untruths, fundamental misstatements, whether deliberately or not, concerning the topic of male sexual trauma. This is where we need to start understanding the broader impact this has on the individual male who has experienced some form of victimization, abuse, or assault, particularly, well, I can say throughout the lifespan, but in particular, we speak of child sexual abuse here. So you can tell I'm working hard to avoid the term myth. And sometimes you hear in public education, oh, there's myths of, I don't know, alcoholism, there's myths of domestic violence. And yet, if we think about that, it's a misuse of the word myth. By definition, a myth is a cultural story. In dominant culture in North America, dominant culture is a culture from Christianity. So we can talk about there are many stories from that faith, and we could call them myth. But if we go to an indigenous community, an American Indian community, we would hear different cultural stories. We would hear different myths. So I want to honor what that word myth is and not use it, and instead talk about this untruth or untruths about this topic as delusions. So with that fine introduction, let me begin. All right, we know that men are harmed, abused. If we talk about sexual abuse of males under the age of 18, we'd be pretty confident we'd be looking at least 1 in 6 males have that experience. Different numbers for adult experiences of sexual assault, certainly. But now, in reflection of this, I'm going to say there's an aspect of the impact it has for the individual fellow, the individual survivor, that he experiences great losses. And in fact, we could conclude that in many respects, he loses himself. He loses his sense of self because it is a consequence of the abuse or assault. It is a consequence of the wounding. Now, very briefly, I want to talk about 3 primary losses. Men who are abused lose their sense of truth, the truth of their experience, because more often than not, they are met with silence. And we're going to look at aspects of that today. Their second loss is the ability to put words to their experience. They experience a loss of speech. And again, compounded with the silence, we know there's so much secrecy on issues of sexual trauma. In part, that's why we do this work here. And here's the third loss. Given the other 2 losses, the third loss that men experience is a profound loss of self-compassion. Now, this is true for survivors of all genders. It's not just a male experience. But today we're here to talk about men. So we know there's a significant impact on the credibility of that individual victim. Let's call him a survivor. He is met with notions of never happened, he's lying, he's exaggerating, he brought it on himself, forget the past and move on. So we do know that guys who have this experience lose themselves. And it's our work, the work of a counselor, the work of a community member, the work for all of us to help them find themselves again. With that as an introduction, let's now start looking at some of these cultural untruths, these cultural delusions. Here's the first one, that males cannot be sexually abused or sexually assaulted. I mean, of course, I wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be here if we didn't believe that this experience happens to men. And yet, if we looked at broader society, we see still lots of evidence to suggest that sexual abuse, sexual assault, if you want to use the word rape, is an experience of women. From how funding streams are chosen to agencies or services in our communities that may be only for female identified survivors, we are still living with the legacy that this issue, which came forward in that second wave of feminism back in the 1970s, 1980s, still is primarily, in some cases, solely identified with women, not men. Here is the second cultural delusion we can look at. The males can always say no to the abuse or the assault if violence is not used. Excuse me. If they didn't say that, if they didn't say no, then they must have wanted it. Now, this statement also can be applied to many female-identified survivors as well. And whoever is saying this has, I'm going to say, little or no conceptualization of the impact of danger and violence on the individual. Freezing is inherently the response of someone who's in danger. This is true for people around the world. This is true for most animals as well. Freezing is a survival response. It's not chosen. It happens. And yet often individual survivors are told, well, if they didn't run away, if they didn't try to fight back, if they didn't say no, they must have wanted it. Third cultural delusion. If a male has allowed, and I'm using quotation marks here, the abuse or assault to occur, then he is a sissy or a weakling, or he has failed the ticket of masculinity. Now we're seeing now here a bringing in gender theory to look at the compounded notion of shame. And if what we can say about dominant masculinity and the dominant nature or notions of masculinity held, say, within North America, then we could say men adhere to the value of being invulnerable. And that's what masculinity often represents. And of course, invulnerable people cannot be abused. The word would suggest it would be impossible. So then for that individual fellow, the sense of shame, of failure, that he no longer is entitled to identify as a man as it is conventionally understood. The fourth cultural delusion. This one may need a little bit more unpacking. If a male becomes sexually aroused during the experience of the sexual abuse or assault, then he is an equal participant in it. Now we know that's false. We know sexual arousal for victims of all genders occurs. Sexual arousal may occur for the individual boy. It may occur with the individual girl. It occurs to men. It occurs with women. This is what we know about the nature of sexual victimization. But here's a difference now, where we can bring in the differential, I want to say, between men and women, is that the male sexual response is obviously more visible than female sexual response. So now we've got this notion of arousal of the victim and how it can be used against him. His offender may say, "Oh, look, you're enjoying this. You're getting off on this. You want this, don't you?" And so the fellow's sexual arousal can be used against him. And here's another layer to that. The individual fellow himself, as he realizes his sexual arousal, may also feel like his body is betraying him. And by his body responding in the way that it does, he may well say to himself, "Well, I must have wanted it. Look at me here." Now, I've been doing therapy work with male survivors for many, many years now. I think probably around 25-year mark. And I can't think of a reason why men are more hesitant to present to a trauma recovery service than this particular misbelief. This statement kind of silences men to not thinking of themselves as being victimized or traumatized, because they believe in the end it was consensual simply by their physiological response, regardless of what they were feeling in their heart, regardless of what they were understanding in the situation. Now let's move along. And here we go. The next delusion, untruth, what have you. Most sexual abuse of males is perpetrated by gay men. This is still quite a common misbelief held by many. And all the research in the world would suggest this is not true. Of course, this is only applying to those sexual assaults that are perpetrated by males. We're going to get more into female offending in a minute. But the only word that we can truly say about who does the sexual offending against male children, male youth, other men, is that there are sex offenders. We're short on words to understand the dynamic of what would make someone sexually offend. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It's not straight male sexual orientation. It's not gay male sexual orientation. And yet, even words like pedophiles that's not necessarily an accurate term for those who sexually offend males. Again, we struggle at times trying to understand, let alone name, those people who sexually offend. But this stereotype that it's an act perpetrated by gay men is false. The research we have on the subject with convicted sex offenders, and where do we find convicted sex offenders? We find them in prison. They would more often self-identify as being heterosexual in their sexual orientation. Again, it doesn't get us very far. The next sexual delusion. There's a misbelief out there that sexual trauma turns a male gay, somehow switches him into being homosexual in sexual orientation rather than heterosexual. And this is, again, profoundly untrue. What we know about our sexual orientation, it's much like Lady Gaga said. We were born that way. Now, our sexual expression throughout our lifespan may be quite malleable, can change. There's lots of evidence to suggest that put males in an all-male environment, whether that be boarding school, prisons, some military context, there will be men who have sex with other men, and yet after they leave the service or they leave the institution, they revert back to their more normative sexual orientation, which is being sexual with females. So we can say with conclusion, sexual trauma doesn't change our sexual orientation. It doesn't make anyone gay. But this is what we do know, that sexual trauma creates a dynamic with many male survivors, and we can call this sexual identity confusion. That's a term out there in the literature. We could even probably more accurately define that as sexual orientation confusion. The question would be something like, am I straight? Am I gay? I don't know. And that dilemma can carry with the fellow throughout many, many years. It doesn't necessarily resolve itself. Sexual identity confusion should not be compared to, or it's not saying they're bisexual. It is a very painful condition of not knowing. So we've had men with sexual identity confusion in our group programming over the years, and they struggle with it. I think one fellow who was he was married to a woman, and yet at times of stress, isolation, possibly in combination with drinking, he would be sexual with other men. Afterwards, he'd feel very shamed, guilty. He promised himself he would never do that again. And yet later on, he would have another situation like that. I worked with gay men who have the same dynamic towards being sexual with females because of their sexual trauma history. So this is what we can talk about, and this is what we know in that regard. And we've got a few more to go here. Here's another one. Sexually abused males, sexually traumatized males, inevitably become sexually abusive themselves. Now, some people say that this is a vampire myth, that once you're bitten, then you bite others. And this is also fundamentally untrue. Only a very small portion of the male survivors go on to sexually harm others. The vast majority do not harm others in this regard. The research out there, it's not as robust as it should be, but we know somewhere in the area of 3% to 14% of sexually abused males, and now I'm talking about research around child sexual abuse, go on to sexually harm others. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's not a concerning number. Of course, we want to end sexual violence in our communities. We have to ensure that those folks who we know are sexually abused do not harm others. There's no doubt about that. But this is such a emotionally laden stereotype that prevents many men from speaking out. I mean, if you put yourselves in the shoes of a fellow who experienced, say, sexual abuse, the average age of sexual abuse of boys is between 9 and 10. Well, he may silence himself because he's worried that if he says these words, other people will think he will become a sex offender. We had a situation a number of years ago. We had a fellow trauma survivor, sexual abuse survivor, on the wait list to receive services at our clinic. His family was involved in child protection services. And in one conversation between this fellow's wife and the child protection worker, she mentioned that he is on the wait list for receiving counseling at our clinic. And the child protection worker said to his wife, well, you better keep your eyes on him because you have children in the house and there's a greater chance he's going to sexually abuse them as a result. And can you just imagine what that experience was like when he heard that? When she heard that, when the wife heard it, and then when the fellow heard it himself. Horribly shaming, horribly painful, and statistically speaking, it's not true. Next, cultural delusion. There's a stereotype out there that if the sex offender is female, then the male, let's say child sexual abuse, the boy or the male youth got lucky. Now, this is only true, of course, if the male youth, the boy himself, is straight oriented. he may believe he got lucky. But the notion of getting lucky has nothing really to do with the experience of being traumatized. And yet we seem to hold on to this, again, untruth as a society. That's not that big a deal. If anything, it was his ticket into being a sexually experienced male as a young man. I don't need to go through what I can recall in terms of old movies that perpetrate this untruth, but there are many. And we still are hear this way too often. Now, there's a flip side to this. So let's talk about the sex offender being male. And let's now talk that the boy or the male youth himself is gay oriented, gay identified. He may know that, he may not know that. There still may be now a same experience that boy got lucky. This ticket into gay male culture. That might be his perception of the experience and how much of that overrides the trauma he also experienced. I remember one fellow I worked with, he was in his early 50s. He attended a boarding school of sorts where he was, in his words, he was in a sexual relationship with one of the teachers. The teacher showed him, they would go away on weekends and go to, I don't know, gay bars or things like that. This fellow, my client, for many years, decades, believed he got this entry into gay male culture. When he came to us, he was in his early 50s, and he had just in the last couple of years realized that he was being sexually offended. It had nothing to do with gay male culture, had nothing to do with getting lucky. And he also realized that it wasn't heartbreak when his offender left him, when he became 20 or when he left the school system. It's probably this perpetrator wanted to move on to other younger males to victimize. Embedded in that last statement is the notion that we need to also recognize female sex offending. The stereotype certainly is that males are the bad guys in terms of risk of sexual offending children. And yet research is getting very clear that 40% of all sex offenders against males, against boys, male youth, anyone up to the age 18 are female. 40% of sex offenders are female. So even that is another delusional statement that offenders are male in definition. Lastly, the last statement I'd like to make is that there's a notion held by many that men or males are less traumatized by sexual violence than females. This is a very tired stereotype that females are more delicate, they're more emotional, they're more vulnerable. And yet as guys, we can kind of suck it up and let it roll off our backs and we're tough. And which is completely untrue. Trauma is trauma. It's trauma. It's not people of all genders experience sexual violence. It's not useful to compare the trauma loads of one gender or another. Someone, I think it was a fellow in one of my groups, said rather wisely, this doesn't need to be a pissing contest. We need to support all folks who have this experience, regardless of their gender. Now, in saying that, services for men may look different than services for women. Maybe in that community center where have you, men come through one door, women come through another, it's different groups. All that is all worthy of discussion. But we can't say one group is more traumatized or less traumatized than the other. So there we go, folks. That's about 10 cultural delusions about male sexual victimization. Many of them have a research base, some do not, though. I'm happy to answer any questions or dig deeper if there are any questions people want to put through. So maybe on that note, I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. Such great information. We had a comment early on.
Okay.
This gets my heart fires burning. Thank you for putting this into words, Rick. I could not agree more. We had another comment specific to the cultural delusion around male abuse victims becoming abusers themselves.
Right.
This person said the vampire myth is such a great descriptor for that fallacy.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I've known men in my life who have decided not to have children because they were sexually abused as a kid. And that decision about not to have children involved a vasectomy. And not something that's easily reversible. And one's like, no, here's an example. It's one example, but an example of how the male experience of sexual trauma, particularly as a child, may be wildly different than a woman survivor. I'm not too sure how many women survivors think that they must avoid the notion of becoming a parent because of their past experiences. And yet, because of that myth, that cultural delusion, how deeply that has impaired those men in their adult lives. It's profoundly sad.
Yeah, thank you. And then we had a couple of folks that kind of agreed with each other on the same point, which was that it's amazing and it's twisted that anyone could use the word luck to describe abuse in terms of, males being heterosexual, identified males being abused by a female, that they, they're getting lucky. But yeah, you still hear it.
Mm-hmm. It's a silencing in its own right. So we can silence people, and they could by not responding to them, and we can silence by using a language like that as well.
Absolutely.
And then again, another example where chances are that girl or that female youth would not be told she got lucky because she was sexually offended. But we apply that to males.
We had a comment. I have known harmed people who did not want to have kids because they didn't think they could keep them safe. I grieve for them.
Yeah, I do too. It's it's a part of the human experience that should not be denied, and yet they're denying themselves for messages that they've heard from others.
Yeah. And then we had a question. I want to ask this question gently, which is hard to put into words succinctly. Okay. When I think about myths or delusions like these across any topic, not just abuse, it makes me wonder how much all of us, even those who do this work and or have lived these experiences, have actually internalized these cultural beliefs. Implicit bias is such a concern in work around racism and social justice, but we don't really talk about implicit bias like this. What are your thoughts about it, and how do we address our own implicit bias, if that's the correct term?
Wow, that's a really good question. And I think there's so much we need to learn more about implicit bias, not just in recognizing it as a concept, but how do we engage with that person who may be demonstrating that, and what is that dialogue like, and how can we pull that off without sounding like we're coming down on them? Years ago, I used to teach college, and I remembered one of my students. This is not something I'm really proud in sharing, but one of my students made a reference to Indigenous people that they weren't trustworthy. I'm not going to say the expression. And I kind of stopped the conversation in the classroom and I said, "Pardon me?" Because I was, both surprised he would make this slur, but I wanted people to bring attention to the power, the harm of that expression. And yet when I saw him respond, I could tell he was just repeating something without even have thought through on that. He was not harboring harmful intention. He was just saying something without consideration. So implicit bias, not a simple topic for us to wrestle with. I think it has great application to this conversation about trauma in our communities, trauma in society. I think we collectively hold such phobia, such implicit bias, such denial of trauma that we can't even put that in everyday discussion. Here we are, we're in a very special place to have this conversation, but you don't hear this conversation on the nightly news, or you don't hear trauma awareness really talked about with young people. This is not stuff we get into. And the more we continue the silence, the more we are enforcing implicit bias. I don't know if I'm really answering your question here, but I just want to say that what you're saying is powerful. I think collectively we've done some work around race and implicit bias, and yet that notion of implicit bias holds true for all divisions we have between people. It's not just race, it's not just gender, it's on and on and on.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. That is a great question. And we've got a few minutes left, so feel free to ask any additional questions if you have them. While folks are thinking, Rick, I had a question for you.
Yeah, shoot. Okay.
So one of my dear friends is a male survivor of child sexual abuse. And in response to the abuse, his own way of trying to heal from the abuse on his own, he developed some very toxic, hyper-masculine behaviors to kind of prove to himself that he was not weak, that he was not gay, all of these, delusions that you're talking about. And in that process, he never sexually abused anyone, but he did harm people through other acts of violence, through insults, especially sexual orientation type of insults. How, in your work with male survivors, how often does it happen that male survivors kind of take on that sort of hyper masculine identity as a way of either showing themselves or others that they are, they're strong, they're not weak, they're not a victim, they're not gay, how often does that occur?
Okay. Good question. I need to say something first, if I may, Becky. We would not, in our programming or public education, I'm speaking on behalf of the clinic I manage, or in our professional training, we do not use the term toxic masculinity. We see that as a harmful term, or a term that's often used as a labeling or discounting, basically saying men are bad. Now, I realize it's not necessarily the intention of the person saying toxic masculinity, saying that all men are bad, but more often than not, that's how the individual fellow will hear that. So I think collectively, we need to move away from that sense of name calling to more accurately get at the concerning behavior. So let's now focus on your friend. Conceptually, we know there are, and I'm bringing in the teaching from David Lisak, who is a colleague of mine and a real big thinker around men and trauma. So I'm honoring his stuff. When a boy or youth experiences sexual abuse, there's only really one of three ways he can walk in life. The first way he can walk in life is, we use the word living a small life. Now, the man who lives a small life knows that he failed the male code. He failed what it takes to be a man because, he was victimized and he let it happen. And, he lives a smaller life as a result. He doesn't ask for what he needs. His experience is diminished. He probably wouldn't even go to counseling because he doesn't feel worthy of his experience. That's one pathway. The second pathway is perhaps the category of your friend. Now, we could call that hypermasculinity, that kind of pumping up of all those codes of behavior we associate with masculinity. We could also say that that's a very active state of avoidance, because chances are when your fellow, and I don't mean to speak about him, but for many men, they won't acknowledge their past sexual harm because it doesn't fit within how they're holding themselves as men. They act in a certain way that suggests that they're invulnerable, that it would be impossible for anyone to do that to them. And we can see this as a bit of a survival strategy. If I need to, as a survivor, kind of armor up in this world and look invincible, well, no one's going to mess with me. So that could be a good, we can understand that as there being a reactive state given past wounding, past victimization. And if we ask that fellow who would be an active hypermasculinity, active avoidance, were you sexually abused as a kid? Not only would we hear the word no, they would say, and what the hell are you getting at anyways? And sometimes we can interpret that, the fear or the discomfort, and say, hearing that, maybe it's some sort of mimicking of the fear he felt when he was small. So I've talked about two pathways for male survivors, and here's the third. And the third is what we call struggle. And these are truly the therapy seekers in the male survivor population. They realize they failed the male code, and yet they also start realizing that this whole male persona is pretty shaky to begin with. That it's not truly what they want or who they are as beings. And through that struggle of holding on to deep masculinity and therefore nothing bad happened, to being a failure of masculinity and not being worthy of help, there's a space that comes up in the middle. And that's where we hear the large majority of men come forward and asking for help. So 3 pathways. If your friend, your colleague, Becky, it sounds like he now puts words to experience, he may have shifted from that pathway of avoidance now into a notion of struggle. And by saying that, by doing that, he can now put words to his experience. And so we find men who do approach for help, for care, who have spent a long, long time in either living a small life or a life of avoidance. And they realize, oh my God, even at my age, I need to ask for help. And that's the hope in doing this work.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. I appreciate that. And also thank you for the correction regarding the toxic masculinity term. I admit that's a term, at least in in previous years, was used quite frequently in the advocacy space. So I appreciate that it has a different impact when it comes to the experiences of men. That's important to know.
I think it's still quite a current term. I think it's and I'm saying this in all due respect, Becky. Like I know you, I know your good heart, and yet it sometimes uses as a blanket statement. And yes, we need to talk about men's grandiosity. We need to talk about why men, collectively, we expect that we deserve a bigger slice of the pie. We've got to talk about men's violence. All that stuff is really critical. However, we've got to be very careful about our language if we want to engage with that individual male and have him shift towards living a life of acceptance and equality.
Yes, excellent point. Thank you. So we had a comment kind of related to that, and then a question. So the comment, I thought that was an interesting point too, because I would assume it is received very differently in rooms of women, female survivors versus men, male survivors, where it may feel weaponized, especially if the females feel they were victimized by someone exhibiting, quote, toxic masculinity.
Right.
And then the question. Go ahead.
I'm going to sneak this in. For men who've been sexually wounded by women, yes, we often hear pretty deep misogyny from those guys. And our female staff, our female-oriented staff, receive that because they were harmed by a female. Therefore, they have more anger, more aspects of hate towards women than towards men. So it often is from our histories. You're right.
Yeah, absolutely. So our question: how can women most effectively support male survivors?
Ooh, another really good question. Boy, oh boy. I think with people who are hurt, especially our loved ones, regardless of gender, our job is to walk with them. Okay. To accompany them, not to lead them. I think a lot of things backfire when we try to lead people. And at the clinic, we get a lot of calls from women about men they love. Their partners, primarily their sons, their brothers. Employers. It goes on, and yet it's really important that they not overstep that role. We say to them, your guy's going to have to call us. We won't be able to set up the appointment because you want that. And again, good intentions, yet you can't overstep. There's a harsh expression. I'm going to say it, but I don't mean it in a harsh way. Is that we've got to keep to our own lanes. And we know guys take a lot longer to come to terms with this issue than women do. On average, guys who come into our program for childhood abuse recovery, their average age is 45. Average age of sexual abuse of boys is between 9 and 10. So on average, it takes guys 3.5 decades before they put up their hands and say, "Oh, I think I need some help on this one." Women survivors, the research would suggest, attend to their wounds on average much earlier, in their mid-late 20s. So we don't know. I wish I knew how to get guys into our program, into getting help on these issues. We don't have any magic on that one. You can assist by, here's a place, here's a phone number you can call, here's something you could check out, but that's it. It's up to that fellow to take the next steps. So that would be my advice.
Great. Thank you, Rick. I know we've come to the end of our time, but I wanted to give you just a couple minutes if you would like to talk a little bit about 1 in 6 and the groups that you lead.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. So 1 in 6, one numeric 1, in6.org, is a nonprofit that Becky referenced. I do some work. I do some work for them. Do some work up here in Canada. 1 in 6 runs online support groups for men. Anyone who's male-defined, who's experienced either childhood sexual abuse or adult sexual assault, we work with both, can join for we run one group for every weeknight or weekday. So we run 5 groups a week. Guys can join, completely anonymous. You have to come up with a nickname, and it's a peer support group. But there's a counselor in the room, not to provide therapy, but to ensure that the conversation is knowledgeable, to move into teaching on pieces as needed, and to make sure that the space is safe for all. So we use it's 2 people that operate the group. My role is to be facilitator, welcome the guys, do that teaching, do that piece. The guys really do the support work for each other. And we have another staffer to examine and approve all statements before they're entered into the group. So we can be assured that the conversation will be safe and respectful and encourage trust to build. For some men, this is their stepping stone to therapy, and for other guys, they have benefited so much through this online sense of community, support, and education. So great resource. And I would suggest sharing that with any male survivors that anyone happens to know.
Great, thank you, Rick. A follow-up question about the groups. Excuse me. Are they voice to voice or typing back and forth?
It's all text. Yeah, it's So it's a text-based platform, and my contributions as facilitator are text-based as well.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everyone who has joined us today. I really appreciate, first of all, thank you, Rick, for the wonderful, wonderful information. I feel like what you presented today just can't be said and shared enough.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who attended and offered some great questions and comments. As I mentioned at the beginning, this presentation is on YouTube, and a recording of it will be available on Survivor Space indefinitely. So feel free to refer back to it if you want, or to share it with others. I also quickly want to give a plug for our upcoming SurvivorCircle session on October 10th at 4 p.m. Zero Abuse Project CEO Jeff Dion will be giving a presentation about abuse within the Boy Scouts, and kind of the lawsuit against them. He is a survivor of abuse in the Scouts, as well as an attorney with experience in civil litigation and sexual abuse cases. So we look forward to that. So thank you all again, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.
Bye, folks.